Hello. I'm excited to tell you guys that we will be trying to do something new at Highway 54 Church of Christ. Well, we know that some have not been able to still come back to church due to COVID, and I completely understand that. We definitely do. So we wanted to make something available to you so that way you can continue to be a part of Highway 54 Church, even while being able to still stay protected in the way that you're needing to take precautions with. So, starting out here within the next couple of weeks, we will be going ahead and doing a Facebook live stream through the Highway 54 Church of Christ Facebook account. And that way, any members that were there, or friends, or if you are brand new to seeing Highway 54, then you can watch as well and see what our church community has, but yet still knowing it's not just within this church building. We continue to be outside of these walls, yes, indeed, and continuing to pray for one another and seek out that help for one another as well. But we just want to make this available for you. I know it's been rough, and I think we had some temporary fixes, but moving on, knowing that COVID's kind of going to be affecting us for quite a while. It's not disappearing soon. So knowing that, then we want to start making some implemented changes, availabilities to making this work for you. So we will be doing this live stream. But today I wanted to go ahead and share this message that we had from this morning and to be able to just catch you up. We've definitely been missing you, and we don't want you to feel left out. And actually, that's kind of part of the sermon that we had today. It's talking about this series. And of course, keep checking those emails. I know we've been trying to keep up through prayer requests as well, and any updated information. That's been awesome that we have. But I wanted to start out by saying, of course, welcome, fellow sheep. And I know last week when we were getting ready to have the sermon and just gather together, it just seemed like a lot of us were just tired, worn out, burdened, and it was just a very strange week. There was a lot going on, and it just felt like we were all in just kind of a little goofy funk kind of situation, and we were just tired. And so the past couple of weeks, we've been going through Old Testament lines from Old Testament characters, and I just realized we need to take a step back. We really do. We need to take a step back and just pause and really wrestle with what this tiredness is going on and how to be able to deal with this. And so this might be you being tired, burnt out, worn out. If it's not you, it might be someone you know. It might be your neighbor, or it might be somebody in your household. And so this message might be for you. It might be for a neighbor. It might be your friend or family member. And we need to remember these things. It was definitely humbling. Now, on the flip side, you might have noticed I said, hello, fellow sheep. I typically never say that. I've never said that before, honestly, until just this week. But I realized through this week, coming up to this sermon, we are sheep. I'm a sheep, and we're sheep. And we see this throughout Scripture where Jesus just, not even just Jesus, but throughout we see how God continues to share that a lot of times we often are like sheep. Now, that would be kind of our twofold message, is looking at what is this fellow sheep, and then also dealing with on the other side of being tired, worn out, burnt out. And you know, this fellow sheep idea, it was crazy because I was just like, man, we're sheep. And then I was like, well, that'd be fun if we would be like, well, hello, fellow sheep. And then I realized, fellow sheep. That's a good replacement for fellowship. Oftentimes when we talk about fellowship, we are talking about in the church. But there are other times too when we get this picture of fellowship where, well, as long as I come to this community and you come to this community and I bring with it what I can bring, some of my gifts, and you bring your gifts along, then in this community we'll be doing well. You know, just bring enough good teachers and bring maybe some counselors in to help this community, and we'll be a pretty good community. But then I was reminded when I said fellow sheep. Fellow sheep brings in this different perspective. Fellow sheep brings in this, vulnerable perspective. See, in fellowship, when I was talking about how it's just all this independent, like I bring this in and you bring this in, for a community, a good community, sometimes we might accidentally almost try building a Tower of Babel. And sometimes we forget this picture of bringing God into this community. We're so focused on all these other things. I've left God out. We've left God out. And so fellowship is a good reminder that we are, yes, sheep. Indeed, sheep in need of our good shepherd. And that's where I'm like, okay, I need to be okay with being a sheep. We need to be okay with being sheep. And that's where we're going to be looking at first. And I look back to this flock of sheep. You know, they're always living together for the most part. They're together and they're living life. And then there's a shepherd that's there to take care of them, watching over them, protecting them. And these sheep, like I have said earlier, are vulnerable. They really don't protect themselves, really. They're vulnerable. And yet they trust their shepherd. They trust their shepherd for protection, for guidance. And they know that while they are vulnerable, they're continuing to try to open themselves and trust their shepherd. And trust that, you know, the hand of their shepherd is taking care of them. And then we also remember that sheep know their shepherd by the voice. Sheep know his voice, and they trust their shepherd. And so I was challenged this week to ask myself, and you all too, are we living vulnerably open to God? Like sheep are vulnerable to their shepherd, are we vulnerably open to our good shepherd? And are we also trusting in his guidance and protection? Those are indeed important questions. If I'm really thinking about us as sheep, how are we being vulnerably open with our shepherd? And then I was also reminded that, like, our good shepherd knows his flock better than we sometimes even know ourselves. And so I was reminded of Matthew 6, verses 7 through 8. And he was talking about how whenever we pray, sometimes we pray and, well, we just don't quite know what to pray for. Or sometimes we're just so focused on all these different things and we forget to pray at the heart of the issue, what's really going on. And so he has said, verses 7 and 8, he had said, and when you pray, this was Jesus speaking, Jesus had said, and when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. So there's some people that are like, well, as long as I speak as much as I possibly can, just blah, 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 just completely let it all out, then God will be impressed and will really hear my prayer. He's saying, no, don't pray like that. It's not about just saying as many words as possible and trying to impress God by any means. And then after verse 7, we'll be singing verse 8 where he says, do not be like them. Don't pray like that, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Again, our shepherd, our good shepherd, knows what we need before we even ask. So there are those times when we're confused and tired, and we can be vulnerable to that. We can say, God, honestly right now, I'm so confused. My mind is in all different areas. I don't even know where to begin. I can't even put words to what my mind is thinking right now. And then yet there's this tiredness that might come along. And we're just reminded that, look, our good shepherd knows what you need before you even ask. And then I was reminded about Romans 8, 26 through 27, when he says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. There's sometimes that honestly, I can't put words to the confusion that's going on, to the tiredness that's in my life, or to even the joys. There's so much joy that's going on in my life that I don't even know where to begin. And so it's like there's this deep sense of something in our life that we just can't put into words. And he says, look, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. He understands. And in verse 27 he says, and he searches hearts. And he who searches hearts know what is the mind of the Spirit. Knows the mind of God. And that's the same Spirit that is working in your life, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. He continues to be there. And we think about, okay, well, look, honestly, if God already knows what's going on in my life, if God already understands the confusion I have in my life, the confusion that's in my head, or the tiredness in my life, or baffled thoughts, or hurtful thoughts, God already knows that. So if God already knows it, then I'm welcomed into vulnerability. This honestly gives us vulnerability. I mean, we are sheep. We are vulnerable. If God already knows, then we can open up to him, because we are not hiding anything from him that he doesn't already know. So straight up, when we're tired, let him know. When we're confused, let him know. When we have unconfessed sin, let him know. It's not a surprise to him. Let him know. When we have doubts, let him know. When we're concerned about a friend, let him know. Honestly, just let him know where you're at. When you're confused about a certain work decision that's being taken place to move ahead, and you're like, I just can't get on board with this. Let God know your confusion about it. Let him know, like, hey, this is what's going on in my life. I mean, you would do that for a best friend anyways, right? And then even too, whenever we are asking about prayer requests, or when we're just listening to a bunch of people and getting to hear what's going on in their life, well, guess what? After a while, that can become burdensome. I mean, that's heavy. It's very heavy in our life, and we just can't handle all of that by ourselves. So be vulnerable. Open that up to God. Say, like, God, this is what's going on. All of these prayer requests and all these burdens that other people are carrying, or maybe Joyce too. And it's like, let God know that. Open up, because it brings us into a vulnerable relationship with our good shepherd. And, I think about this community while we are living together and asking how we're doing. We're checking in. We must check in with each other. But we think about this vulnerability. We think about this community. And I think about the sheep, how they live in these flocks and in these communities, and they're just living life together. They have a relationship with one another. But, a relationship cannot go very far if there's no conversation. We must have conversation if we're going to be living in community. A community and relationship will not go very far without a conversation. So we must talk. We must talk and have that relationship. We have this relationship with one another, fellow sheep. We also have this relationship with our good shepherd. But when we talk about a relationship with fellow sheep, we come down to praying for one another as well. And at Highway 54, I've loved our emails. Our emails have come out, and we've continued to see prayers for one another in the church. We've continued to see prayers for neighbors that we have, and we've continued to see prayers for the communities. We've continued to see prayers for even the country. And I'm so glad that we're able to come together recognizing that our community is not just at Highway 54. It's not. I'm glad that we recognize that we are praying for one another outside of these walls, no matter who is at Highway 54, no matter if they are a Christian or not. But please, as fellow sheep, we have a relationship with one another. Check in with one another. Pray for one another. Because see, when we lose sight of checking in on one another, there's kind of a little crack. There's a distance that begins to build up. And, well, as fellow sheep, as a sheep, we begin to wander off. We really do. When we're not checking in on one another, there's a distance in community. There's a distance in relationship. When we're not checking in on one another, even I might become distant. I may feel lonely, alone, and just set apart from the rest of our community, from our fellow sheep. And this is dangerous. It's very dangerous, because when we're off alone, honestly, that's when we see Satan continue to pop in, because he's prowling around ready to seek to devour and destroy. It's a whole lot easier when there's one sheep off by itself. One of our fellow church members, she was reminding me about when she was growing up, they had sheep. And honestly, there's a lot of care that it takes with sheep. They do wander off so quickly. And if there would be any kind of coyotes that come through or wild dogs that be coming through, honestly, if there was a lonely sheep by itself, it would be devoured. And so I just think about that. Honestly, it's so crazy that God really sets us up to show that we are like sheep. We live in community to continue to help each other, to guide one another, and to check in on one another. And so we have this relationship with one another. Last week we were talking about how what Satan deems to destroy, well, God redeems for good. So let me say that again. What evil or Satan deems for destruction or to destroy by, then God redeems for good. And that's what we were talking about last week. And then sometimes we have to recognize that, look, that destruction, that destroying might not always happen suddenly, like a car crash or a large impact that just hits you. And you're like, oh my goodness, what just happened? It doesn't always happen like that. Sometimes Satan destroys patiently, slowly over time, and he just kind of nudges us toward backsliding. And I couldn't help but think of Screwtape Letters with C.S. Lewis. If you haven't read it, well, there's this Uncle Screwtape, and he's trying to teach his nephew, Wormwood. And actually, this uncle, he's a demon. Screwtape is a demon, and he is trying to teach his nephew how to be a successful demon, how to do a good job at what he's supposed to be doing, making people stumble and leave the faith and question God, and just try to make him backslide as much as he can. And the uncle was saying, you know what? He said, look, please recognize the fact that it doesn't have to happen suddenly. And this is when C.S. Lewis says in his book, indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, and without millstones or without signposts. You know, there's not going to be a big sign up on the highway saying, if you take a right here, you're on your way to hell. He's saying, no, the safest way to hell is the gradual one, the slow one. And as sheep, being vulnerable, if we're not checking in on each other, we're begin to find ourselves wandering off away from the rest of the flock. And we start to wander off, and before we know it, well, it was just a hill. It was just a gradual slope, and next thing we know is we've taken those steps as sheep to go further and further, and then there's the cliff, and we missed it. We missed the opportunity to come back, and after you fall off the slope, it's gone. That cliff is there, and you're gone. And so, as fellow sheep, check in on each other. Help each other, guide each other back, check in. How are we doing? And then, while I'm realizing that I am vulnerable, I realize I am a sheep. And I need my shepherd. And that's okay. It's great to know that we are vulnerable. It's great to know that we are sheep. And with that comes the humility, the vulnerability, and the trust to say, I need my shepherd. You know, in the times whenever we're talking about sheep, and sometimes we have a backlash, like, no, I don't want to be a sheep. I want to be independent. I want to be strong. And it's just, it's not the time to be a superhuman or super sheep by our own independence. We are sheep. We are vulnerable. That's okay. We recognize that we need our good shepherd. And we are in need of our shepherd's protection as well. And Isaiah 53:6 reminds me of that. He goes on, he says, all of us like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. It seems pretty self-explanatory. It really is. All of us like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned away at some point saying, God, I've got this on my own, okay? And we leave the flock, we leave the protection from our good shepherd, and we say, I'm going my own way. And then it goes on to say, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He says, look, the good shepherd has taken any of those wanderings upon himself. All of our sins he's put upon himself. And honestly, that sounds like the gospel. It sounds like Jesus Christ coming in and saying, look, I know you have wandered. I'm coming in. I'm taking in your sin. I'm putting it upon myself. Our good shepherd brings us back. He says, come home. This is our flock. I will guide you. I will protect you. And then he goes on to say, he'll even lay down his own life to save us. Which means I need a relationship with my shepherd. I need to know my shepherd. And we have that relationship with our shepherd then. We have a relationship with our fellowship, and we also have a relationship with our shepherd. And he says that, Jesus spoke of himself as the good shepherd who knows his sheep and would lay down his life for them. We see this in John 10, toward the latter half, in 7 through 18, in those verses. But then to look even before that, I want us to look at John 10, verses 2 through 5. And he's sitting here and he's saying, look, there's false teachers. There's these people that come in to try to steal you, who are thieves trying to take you away from this flock, who are trying to guide you away from it. And he says, look, in verse 1, he says, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. Clearly, if he wasn't going through the gate that was locked, and he's like jumping over the fence trying to take in some sheep, that clearly seems like a robber. That seems like a thief. And at that time, like, there would have been this gatekeeper, and he would have known the shepherd that was coming in and would open up the gate for the shepherd to come through and say, yes, I know you are the shepherd here. And he wouldn't do that to a thief. So the thief would have to find a different way through. And so Jesus is saying, look, the good shepherd gets to come through that gate. He comes to the gate, and he says in verse 2, but he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. He doesn't need to try to find some way in. Verse 3, he says, to him the gatekeeper opens. And that's what we were just saying. The gatekeeper opens to the shepherd. And the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. He leads them out. He doesn't even have to try herding them out. Like, come on, get. He just calls them by name and they follow. That's our good shepherd. Verse 4, he says, when he has brought us out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. The sheep follow because they know his voice. They know that voice. And he says in verse 5, a stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. And you know what? It's clear. It says the sheep follow the voice they know, and they run away from the stranger. And it hits home. It makes me ask, if I follow the voice I know, which voice do you know the best? That's for each of us to ask. And to recognize even for other people too. Which voice do they know more? Because honestly, I don't want to find out and realize, I've turned away from the voice of my good shepherd, and I've been listening to what Satan's been telling me, and I've been listening to this slow, gradual slope that Satan's trying to take me down, and I've been listening to these lies and these things that aren't true, and it's like, I don't want to know Satan's voice better than I know the voice of my good shepherd. I don't want to run away from my good shepherd because I say, I don't know your voice, and just whoosh, and turn around and start running towards Satan. I hope that I know the voice of my good shepherd more than I know the voice of Satan himself. I hope that is a way for each of you, and recognize that some people really do know the voice of Satan better than they've ever heard the voice of God. Check in on each other, fellow sheep. Fellow sheep, check in. Whose voice are we listening to more? We must know God's voice more than the voice of Satan. I don't ever want to run away from God's voice because he seems like a stranger to me. It's crazy that Jesus really keeps going on this point that he is the good shepherd. Look at verse 11. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. See, there were other shepherds that were just kind of hired and they didn't really have any care for the sheep. It was just kind of an asset. And they were like, dude, if there was a wolf that was coming in, I'm not putting my own life in harm's way. I'm sorry, sheep, you're just a thing. You're out. I'm running. And Jesus says, no, I am the good shepherd. I am the one that stays and fights when those wolves come. I'm the one that fights and will even lay down my life for you, for my sheep. He says it again just 3 verses later. He says in verse 14, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. He says it multiple times. And think about that. How close of a relationship is that with our good shepherd? When we think about a relationship that Jesus and God has, there's no splitting that. It is so close, and it's like thinking about us as vulnerable sheep. If I am vulnerable, if I am indeed vulnerable, I want to be vulnerable to my good shepherd. I don't want to be vulnerable to Satan. I don't want to be vulnerable to the thief that comes in trying to destroy. I don't want to be vulnerable to the false teachings. I want to be vulnerable to my good shepherd. If I'm going to be vulnerable, I want to be vulnerable to him. I want to know that I am vulnerable and have my life in his hands, in the hands of my good shepherd. That's who I want to be vulnerable to. In fact, Jesus says, yes, I will lay down my life for my sheep. I care about them so much. This is love. In John 15, I couldn't help but think of this part where he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And he says, look, you are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I just call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. I've shared as intimately as I can the intimate relationship I have with God. You are my friend. I'm giving this to you. I love you. He says, love has no greater than this, than to lay down one's life for another. Jesus Christ loves us. He is the good shepherd. And this just leads to needing to build that relationship with him. To build that relationship with him calls us to vulnerability. Because vulnerability leads to trust. And we have this vulnerability that we have with our good shepherd. We can bring our burdens to him. We can bring our joys to him. We can bring our confusion. We can bring our tiredness all to him. So, since we are like sheep, we can trust our good shepherd, and our good shepherd knows us. Since all of that can be true, then we can be honest and vulnerable with him. Be honest with him. Be open. Because there is not anything going on in your life that's not honest, that's a surprise to God. There's nothing in your life that's a surprise to God. So be vulnerable with him. Just let him know, honestly, what's going on in your life. And there's something about being honest, vulnerable, and open. Think about it from a parent's perspective. Even a teacher. But I really want to think about a parent's perspective. We think about a parent and a child. This parent oftentimes knows what's going on in the child's life. Oftentimes. And the child doesn't have to speak a word. But there's something about bringing and building a relationship between a child and a parent when the child comes up and says, Mom or Dad, I gotta tell you something. It's been going on for a while. And the parents are like, in their mind, they're like, I know it's been going on for a while. And the kid says, look, my best friend, well, at least I thought he was my best friend. Well, he's just been doing all these mean things to me lately. And you've kind of noticed. You've noticed that the best friend hasn't quite been the best friend he once was. And things have been hurting your son or daughter. But it just means something when they're vulnerable, or they open up enough to say, I'm going to be vulnerable with you, Mom. I'm going to be vulnerable with you, Dad. I want you to know what's going on in my life. And the parents may already know. But there's something about opening up and saying, I trust you. I want you along this journey with me. So confess to God what's going on. Yes, He knows. But there's something about being honest that leads into a vulnerable relationship with Him. Taking a step of trusting God and our Good Shepherd. We're giving our lives into God's hands when we confess and are vulnerable to Him. Because we're recognizing, if I am a sheep and I'm already vulnerable, I'd rather be vulnerable in the hands of my Good Shepherd than in anybody else. So trusting Him as our Good Shepherd, that's what we need. Being reminded that we are indeed, yes, sheep. Because God becomes, and He comes beside us. When we welcome this sheep-shepherd relationship, we recognize that we have this journey together. And I couldn't help but think of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. He talks about bringing our burdens to Him. And he says in that verse 28, He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me. And that yoke, they would have had it with the oxen. And the oxen would have been, it was this thing that would put the ox together as they continue on this journey while they were plowing the fields. And it was kind of heavy. And Jesus is saying, look, stop trying to take your yoke up on yourself, all by yourself. It's heavy. Come over here. Walk beside me. Take up my yoke. Take up my yoke and learn from me. Walk with me. I'll take you on this path. We're plow through this life together. Take it up with me. He continues to say, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Jesus was so humble enough to honestly come on this earth to deal with the pains that humans deal with, and to say, I'm going to walk beside you. I'm humbling myself. He could have stayed in heaven without having to deal with any of the pains that we deal with, without dealing with the pressures that we deal with, without dealing with the illnesses and the sickness. He came on this earth to walk with us, to walk right beside us and say, here's my yoke. I want you to have this with me. I want us to walk together. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Bring it to Him. Fellow sheep, we have to bring our life to our Good Shepherd. Be vulnerable to Him. So fellow sheep, check in. Fellow sheep, check in with one another. Check in with the community. Check in. And fellow sheep, be vulnerable sheep. We already are. It just figures out where are we going to put our vulnerability at. If we're going to be vulnerable, then I sure hope we're putting our vulnerability in good hands. And I know the good hands that I can put my vulnerability in is our Good Shepherd. I trust Him. I know I don't understand half the stuff that's going on in my life. I don't understand what's going on in my mind half the time. I definitely know most people don't either. But I'd rather know that my vulnerability is in the hands of my Good Shepherd. So be fellow sheep with God, with our Good Shepherd. In prayer, open up our hearts to letting God work. There was this, there's kind of like this surgery, and we talk about that heart transplant. Being vulnerable enough to open up our hearts to a heart transplant is a whole lot of trust. I sure hope the doctor knows what he's doing, because I'm putting my entire life into his hands. It's being vulnerable. So when we're praying and we're saying, God, please, I want to be vulnerable to you. I want to have an open heart to hear you, to hear your voice and to know your voice as our good shepherd. When that happens, we also open our life to the challenges our good shepherd might be asking of us. And it may honestly be to speak to our neighbor about some things that God is asking us to share. It was weird, but yes, it was rewarding. It's cool whenever, and honestly, it's a part of accountability too. When I'm being vulnerable with God and I'm saying, God, I want to have an open heart with you, God. I want to be vulnerable to you. I want you to work on my life wherever it needs, and I want to be vulnerable to you, whatever you say. And then he asks us to take action, to move. There's accountability there. There's a vulnerable accountability saying, I wanted to be vulnerable to God. Now I need to be vulnerable to take action. I need to be vulnerable enough to take action, to take that step and to say, God, my life is in your hands. And I'll go where you ask. Because you are the good shepherd, and I'm the sheep. And I know your voice, and you're calling me forward. And I want to follow you. So let's be vulnerable. Vulnerable sheep to our vulnerable... We need to be vulnerable sheep to our good shepherd. Be open. Have our life and heart open to him. So vulnerable sheep. Please, we need to be fellow sheep. We need to be fellow sheep. So fellow sheep, please, I'm talking with all of us. Fellow sheep, be vulnerable to God. We are vulnerable. Let's be vulnerable to our good shepherd. And check in with our other fellow sheep.